changing face of Julian Assange, a physical transformation that rather mirrors his rise and fall over the past decade. This week, he was in court in London, fighting extradition to the United States, where he's wanted for allegedly conspiring to hack military computers and violating America's Espionage Act. When not in court, the founder of WikiLeaks resides in Belmarsh prison. Before that, he spent nearly 7 years holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, trying to prevent this very thing, extradition, from happening. He is in such a vulnerable position right now, and yet, a decade ago, he was the toast of the liberal media, helping to uncover the dark secrets, as he put it, of the US government and others.
It was this year that he and the site rocketed to fame.
With WikiLeaks, we help you get the truth out. Get it, give it to us. You'll help change history.
Light them all up.
Julian Assange first came to prominence in 2010, publishing this classified US military video showing an American helicopter killing civilians.
That video caused a sensation when Assange got hold of it and posted it on his WikiLeaks website.
This is a man with a mission to keep on leaking.
This is the story of the war since 2004.
The White House blasting the release of over 90,000 U.S. military records on the war in Afghanistan.
The United States strongly condemns the illegal disclosure of classified information.
I'm concerned about the disclosure of sensitive information from the battlefield that could potentially jeopardize individuals or operations.
We are subverting illegitimate authority.
The WikiLeaks website released nearly 400,000 secret U.S. files on the Iraq war late today. It was the largest leak of classified U.S. files in history.
The United States is fronting a diplomatic disaster with the release of hundreds of thousands of classified documents and cables by whistleblower website WikiLeaks.
Administration officials say that these leaks will have far-reaching implications when it comes to U.S. foreign policy.
But has WikiLeaks actually committed a crime? The short answer is it's unclear.
His website's motto is "We open governments," and that is what WikiLeaks has tried to do.
You seem to enjoy stirring things up.
Well,
we are all individuals.
When government is illegitimate, government taints everything beneath it. The first casualty of war is the truth.
Well, let's bring in our guest now. At the top left there, we have Philip Adams, a Free Julian Assange campaigner from Australia. To his right, we have Anna Bradshaw, a partner at a law firm which specializes in extradition cases. And we're also joined by Ben Norton, a journalist in New York, who's interviewed Assange on a couple of occasions. Ben, I'd like to come to you first of all. You know, Assange's lawyer, Edward Fitzgerald, argues that he shouldn't be extradited. And one of the reasons is because he's a suicide risk. Now, you have a colleague in the court during the hearings. What has he relayed to you about Assange's mental and physical health?
It's very clear that Assange's health is very poor at the moment. And this isn't even just something new. This is something we've witnessed over the past several years. The UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Nils Melzer, has said repeatedly, in an official status, he has said that he believes that Assange has suffered from psychological torture. And just last week, in fact, more than 100 doctors from 18 countries published an open letter in the medical journal Lancet saying that Assange has suffered from symptoms of torture and could potentially be even on the verge of death. So his health is in a very poor status. I've heard from my colleague Kevin Gostola, who's reporting inside the courtroom.
Anna, is Julian Assange's mental health a strong enough argument, do you think, to potentially block extradition?
Well, like all other arguments, his defense team have to demonstrate the health position to the requisite standard. If the court can be persuaded that his physical or mental state is such that it would be unjust or oppressive to extradite him, then the proceedings can be either adjourned or he can be discharged from them. This is obviously going to be very much a matter for the court to decide, and it should do so based on the evidence in front of it alone. It's not the only ground on which Mr. Assange could potentially resist his extradition, but it is, as I understand it, one of the main ones.
Yeah, the other one being that they're worried, Assange's lawyers are worried that he would not be afforded a fair trial in the United States, partly because they believe it to be a politically motivated case. What do you make of that?
Well, there are two overlapping grounds here, and the first is the political motivation. If it can be demonstrated, again, to the court's satisfaction, that the extradition request was made for improper, i.e. political motives, or if it can be demonstrated that on his return he would be subjected to a trial and potential punishment that was influenced by improper, i.e. political motivations, then that would be a ground for the court to refuse extradition. There is an overlap here with the fair trial rights that Mr. Assange has under the European Convention on Human Rights. Again, if the court can be satisfied that Julian Assange would not stand a fair trial on his return to the United States, then that would be in itself a ground to refuse extradition.
Philip Adams, you're in Australia, where Assange is from. You're trying to get your fellow citizen freed. Tell us about your campaign.
Well, first and foremost, it must be understood that that the right to petition Parliament in Australia is embedded in the Federation of Australia since 1901. It is in fact the only way for a citizen to present their grievances before Parliament. The only way. Now, the petition that I formed was I formed it because I felt there was a huge gap in the campaign to free Julian Assange. The petition specifically is called Free Julian Assange Before It's Too Late for No US Extradition. I followed exactly what Julian Assange had stated and formed the petition on July 11, 2018. It has now just past 300,000 signatories. It has also been the foundation for the formation of the Bring Assange Home Parliamentary Group, which is now staffed by 14 currently sitting parliamentarians and supported by approximately 20. This is a petition that is demanding the intervention at a ministerial level of the Prime Minister and/or the Foreign Minister. The
problem is, Philip, is that many people would say this is a matter between the United States and United Kingdom, and that even if you could persuade the Australian government to intervene, it wouldn't make a blind bit of difference.
No, you see, in these exceptional circumstances, people where the individual human rights of an Australian citizen are being violated, such as was the case with David Hicks in Guantanamo Bay, where it triggered the intervention by Barnaby Joyce, who is now the former Deputy Prime Minister, currently sitting Minister of Parliament, under the guise of habeas corpus, basically illegal detention. It triggered a response by the Prime Minister, John Howard, in order to free David Hicks, and it was successful. So it's important to understand that with these exceptional circumstances, where human rights are being violated, high-profile cases, with a particular case with Julian Assange, we're talking about they're basically subservient to US extraterritorial jurisdiction being extended over citizens of the Western world, including Australia. Julian Assange was not in the United States when he published. He is a journalist, a highly awarded journalist, and we are demanding senior ministerial intervention in order to speak to Boris Johnson, speak to Donald Trump, get our man home.
Okay, we're going to take a look at some of those issues a little later. Ben, I just want to, for the sake of our viewers who perhaps don't have a strong grounding in Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, I just want to take a look back on his life. You know, there have been so many twists and turns, even turned into a Hollywood movie in 2013, The Fifth Estate.
Man is least himself when he talks in his own person. But if you give him a mask, he will tell you the truth.
Can we just start at the beginning, though? Why did he start WikiLeaks in 2006?
Well, Julian Assange is a journalist, and he's also a techie. He's very much into the internet, to new technologies, and this was really the zeitgeist at the time when he founded WikiLeaks in 2006. There were many new technologies being developed, new forms of social media that have really shaped the internet as we know it today. And WikiLeaks was conceived of as a kind of new journalistic outlet to publish investigative journalism and to publish work that whistleblowers wanted to be released to the world, information that is in the public interest, that can enrich democracies.
You know, we saw at the beginning of the program that it was really in 2010 when WikiLeaks shook up the world by publishing thousands of secret US military files related to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, this video from Iraq showing US forces shooting at what we later found out were civilians and 2 Reuters journalists. Let's listen for a brief moment.
Light them all up.
202 traffic, 260.
Come on, fire. Hey, Roger. Keep shooting. Keep shooting.
Ben, you would argue that it is important for the world to see this video and all the files. Why?
Absolutely. Because the war in Iraq in the first place was an illegal war. The United Nations made that very clear. And it's also important to see what the United States was doing in this illegal war, killing civilians, targeting even journalists in that case. This is known as the collateral murder video. And WikiLeaks publishing was absolutely in the public interest because it shows that this war, the US government claimed that it was protecting civilian lives. The US government claimed that it was taking precautions, but it's simply not true. And WikiLeaks also published similar information on the war in Afghanistan and the Afghan War Diary that similarly showed how the US government claimed, in the war in Afghanistan specifically, the US government claimed that it was a legal war and that it was taking precautions to defend civilian lives. And we see once again that it was not telling the truth, that this is once again a lie.
But did it come at a cost, Ben? Because the lawyers arguing for his extradition say that WikiLeaks put dissidents in Afghanistan and Iraq at risk of serious harm, torture, and even death. Do you accept that?
There's no evidence of this whatsoever, and numerous press freedom groups have emphasized that this is always the argument that the US government has used, and other governments, to justify really these attacks on the First Amendment, these attacks on the freedom of press. And let's be clear here, this case is one of the gravest attacks on the freedom of press we've seen in decades. This is not just my view. Numerous groups like the Freedom of the Press Foundation, the Committee to Protect Journalists, Amnesty International, they have all emphasized that were Assange to be extradited to the US in this case, that it could have major implications for other journalists, not only in the United States, but journalists around the world.
The accusation is that Assange and the former Army intelligence specialist there, formerly known as Private Bradley Manning, now known as Chelsea Manning, conspired to steal from and hack into the Department of Defense computer system, and that anyone who does that, including journalists, are guilty of computer misuse. Now, that's the thing, Anna, isn't it? They're not. They're saying whether you're a journalist or not doesn't matter. There's still a crime here.
Well, the British Extradition Court does not have to decide on Mr. Assange's guilt or innocence. It simply has to ask itself whether the conduct that he has allegedly engaged in would, had it taken place in the UK, also amount to an offence under UK law, in theory. And computer hacking is an offence under UK law. Leaking potentially confidential state information is a breach of the Official Secrets Act in the UK, had it taken place here. Now, the circumstances of the particular...
Philip, come in.
It was a conspiracy to hack a computer. There was no hacking. In actual fact, Chelsea or Bradley Manning at the time had full clearance to actually, from my understanding, to access the information.
It's obviously important to be factually correct, and my apologies, I should have referred to a conspiracy. But in terms of the legal analysis, a conspiracy is just as much an offence as actual hacking, in the same way that, for example, an attempted offence is as much an offence as a completed offence.
Ben, presumably when Manning took the role as an intelligence analyst, must have been subject to some sort of confidential agreement, no?
Well, of course, but this is the point of whistleblowers, is that whistleblowers are technically violating some principles of secrecy, but the point is that whistleblowing is in the public interest, and whistleblowers are willing to take these risks and potentially risk, imprisonment, incarceration, because they believe that the information that they're releasing to the public is going to benefit people, is going to benefit democracy, enrich the world. And what Chelsea Manning leaked absolutely has enriched our understanding, has enriched American democracy.
Now, the big leaks which came in 2010 predominantly related to the George W. Bush era. So at that stage, a lot of Democrats and liberal media were sympathetic and prepared to work with Julian Assange. But then, in 2016, 1 month before the US election in which Hillary Clinton was up against Donald Trump, WikiLeaks published thousands of emails from Hillary's campaign director, John Podesta, which were unflattering, to say the least. And Clinton blames WikiLeaks for losing the election.
I was on the way to winning until the combination of Jim Comey's letter on October 28th and Russian WikiLeaks raised doubts in the minds of people who were inclined to vote for me but got scared off.
Back to Ben in New York. Now, Ben, you interviewed Julian Assange shortly after he released Hillary Clinton's emails. What was the motivation there?
Clearly, this information was in the public interest. And the idea that there are two conspiracies here that we need to debunk. One, the idea that WikiLeaks was somehow pro-Trump and working with Trump. There is no evidence of this. All of the so-called evidence has been debunked and shown as either false or misleading. And in my interview and in other interviews, Assange made it clear that he did not favor Hillary Clinton or Trump. Now, let's be clear, he was vehemently opposed to both of the candidates, to such a degree that in one interview, he actually said choosing between Trump and Clinton is like choosing between cholera and gonorrhea. So he had very strong feelings about both candidates, clearly, but he was sent this information and he verified that it was true. Not only these emails from John Podesta, the head of Hillary Clinton's campaign, but also internal documents from the DNC. And he realized that it was in the public interest, and he published those documents. And this idea that it only helped Trump is preposterous. One, because another person who benefited greatly and whose campaign benefited was Bernie Sanders, who is now the leading candidate for the Democratic primary process going on right now, who has won the first 3 primaries. And Bernie Sanders, his campaign suffered greatly at the hands of the Democratic National Committee, the head of the Democratic Party. And we know that thanks to the emails published by WikiLeaks that showed that the DNC, which claims to be a neutral arbiter, a neutral actor, had in fact, from the very beginning of the primary process, been working with the Hillary campaign against Bernie's campaign.
But in the end, Bernie didn't win, Trump won, and a lot of people will say your argument that he's enhancing American democracy should be turned on its head. It's actually perverting US democracy.
Well, what's interesting is there's a double standard here. No one ever accuses the New York Times, Fox News, of subverting democracy if they publish information, what's famously known as the October surprise. On the eve of the election, it's well known that some of the worst scandals are released that month as a form of weaponized attacks on the opposing campaign. So that's often how journalism works in general, but WikiLeaks is held to a different standard because WikiLeaks is a new kind of journalism that publishes this information and lets everyone see it instead of just publishing it through an article.
Do you think that was the moment that many liberal politicians and media outlets fell out of love with Julian Assange and WikiLeaks?
That's certainly a major factor in the kind of partisan politics approach to understanding WikiLeaks. I think it's absolutely true that many Democrats no longer support WikiLeaks because of the 2016 election. But it was also publications that WikiLeaks released before the 2016 election. WikiLeaks also, for instance, published the leaked draft of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a massive corporate trade agreement that was being negotiated in secret. And the Obama administration was trying to push through this massive kind of NAFTA-style agreement on a global stage.
Philip, I want to come to you. What's his support like back at home? What does the media make of him in Australia?
As far as the mainstream media is concerned, you'd almost say it's a media blackout. The only publication or reporting on this massive petition, that's a historic petition, has been from the local media, the regional newspapers. As far as the ABC, SBS, Channel 7, Channel 9, Channel 10, nothing at all. It's quite.
Why do you think that is?
I think we can speculate as to why it is. The media in Australia is staffed by reporters, not journalists, puppets. Anybody that speaks out against the official line loses their job, and this campaign has exposed that. It is in plain sight. It's astounding that it hasn't been reported, and it's also remarkable that the petition has got to the position that it is at with no reporting at all. It's actually been a campaign that's been run purely on the web and has been an organically growing petition.
Well, whatever the media and politicians think, there are still many ordinary people who are willing to stick up for Assange, and hundreds of them made their voices heard in London over the weekend ahead of the hearings.
It's Saturday morning in central London, and there's no shortage of support for Julian Assange.
No extradition! It's only one decision!
Assembling for a march outside Australia House, this decorated crowd includes a number of high-profile defenders of the WikiLeaks founder. One of them is iconic British fashion designer Vivienne Westwood, whose son Joe Carey says extradition for Assange would send a much wider message.
That has a signal for all journalists all over the world that says the United States, if you publish their information, can take you from anywhere in the world and take you back and put you in concrete for 175 years, which is a death sentence.
Also marching towards Parliament House alongside Assange's father John Shipton is the former Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis. He says Assange published essential public information.
What we have is an assault on journalism. The only charge against Julian, hiding behind the nonsense of espionage, is a charge of journalism.
It was a wet, grey morning in London this morning, but the sun has come out and so have the people in London in solidarity of Julian Assange. This city was the epicentre of so much of his case, and you can feel there's a huge buzz today as people want to say they want him. For WikiLeaks ambassador and journalist Joseph Farrell, the motivation for the march was simple. What's the message that you want to send today?
Drop the case.
To Anna now. Anna, to be clear, the default setting for the United Kingdom is to allow the extradition of suspects to the United States unless there's a strong argument, a convincing argument to do otherwise.
Indeed, the normal rule is that extradition should be granted. Extradition should, theoretically speaking, only be refused in the most exceptional of circumstances.
But do you think Julian Assange will qualify to be part of that minority?
It's very hard to say, and of course we have some very interesting examples of where extradition requests from the US have been refused in the past, and the obvious ones that immediately spring to mind are Gary McKinnon, equally Laurie Love a few years later. Both were sought by the US, both were ultimately successful in resisting their extradition and on broadly similar grounds to those advanced now by Mr. Assange.
That's right. Does public pressure ever make a difference in your experience?
It shouldn't, is the legal answer. It should not influence the judge's decision on whether or not extradition can go ahead. If the judge comes to that conclusion, the decision then passes to the Secretary of State, who should make the final call, as it were. But she has very little discretion to refuse extradition at that stage. And the grounds on which she can do so are not exactly relevant here. The death penalty, for example, would be one consideration, but here you would expect the US authorities to be in a position to assure the Home Secretary that the death penalty would not be imposed. Now, having said that, the amount of publicity that this case has attracted worldwide and the amount of calls being made from various quarters, many of which we've discussed already, these are going to be difficult considerations for anyone to ignore. To what extent they will impact on the judge's final decision will reflect the extent to which they can be baked into the defense team's representations.
Okay, well, we shall follow this story in the weeks and months ahead. Anna and Ben, Philip, thank you all for your contributions to the Nexus. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. Do check out our channel on YouTube. Until next week, though, goodbye.